Today's message is Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. I have it here on the screen. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." The overall message title is Prepared in the Wilderness, and those verses were Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. Here we see when God called Moses in Exodus chapter 3. He didn't find him in the palace, though of course that's where he was brought up for the first of his 40 years. He found him in the wilderness. Moses had once lived with power and prestige in Egypt, but for the last 40 years he had been in Midian, tending sheep. To most, it might have seemed like he had been sidelined, but in God's plan he was actually being trained. For 40 years, of course, we read that Moses was being a shepherd. Here we read he was tending the flock there, and also he led the flock there in Exodus chapter 3. But here we see that Moses was a shepherd. It wasn't glamorous, but it was intentional. Shepherding his father-in-law's flock was something that taught him lessons that the palace never could. First of all, he learned patience. He learned patience with stubborn sheep, just as he would need with the Israelites. This prepared him for leading the stubborn people Israel through the wilderness. Exodus 32, Numbers 14, of course. You remember they sent the spies out, but of course they would not go into the land even though God had promised it. And Moses had to learn patience with stubborn sheep, and that was to help him in his capacity as a leader and a shepherd of God's people. Then secondly, he learned how to lead gently in hard places, finding water, safety and direction, all of which he did for the sheep. He would have to do that for God's people later on in his life. And also he'd have to do it in the desert. You notice that in the passage in Exodus chapter 3, it mentions the desert, the backside of the desert, and of course he was to do that for God's people. He was to find water, he was to offer safety and direction, and he was to intercede and care for God's people like a shepherd. Remember in Numbers 27 when Moses asked God who's he going to appoint, he uses the expression that there should be a leader, that God's people would not be like a sheep without a shepherd. And of course that was something that he had learned in these 40 years in the wilderness. And thirdly, he learned to protect the weak, stay alert and endure long silent seasons of obscurity. Lessons that shaped his character and foreshadowed later moments when he protected Israel from Pharaoh. You remember with the plagues, Exodus chapters 5 to 12. Intervened when they were under attack. You remember Amalek came to attack them, Exodus chapter 17. And remember Moses interceded. He held up his hands along with the help of Aaron and Hur. And he interceded when God's judgment threatened them in Exodus 32. You remember that's after the 10 Commandments were given to Moses. The people were worshipping the golden calf, and it was Moses pleading with God that prevented less than 3,000 people being taken in God's discipline on the nation. Of course, then came the moment in Exodus chapter 3 of the burning bush. God got his attention through something unusual, a bush that burned, but there was not consumed. When Moses turned aside to see, God called him by name. This shows us something important. Sometimes God waits for us to pause, notice, and draw near before he speaks. And then, of course, we read the words, take off your sandals. The place you'll stand on is holy ground. It wasn't the location that was holy. It was the presence of God. And if you like, this was the start of Moses' commission of being the rescuer, or at least the one whom God used to rescue his people. Everything Moses had learned in Midian, the humility, the patience, the dependence, was preparation. He wasn't wasting time. He was being equipped to lead a much harder flock, the people of Israel. 40 years in Midian seemed like a forgotten season, but God was shaping him. Acts chapter 7 verse 30 says, after 40 years he had passed, there appeared to him an angel in the flame of a burning bush. This long season in the wilderness developed humility, which was to come later on, Numbers chapter 12. Dependence upon God, Exodus chapter 4, and a heart for God's people, which we'll see later on in Exodus chapter 3. And so 3 things to finish. Are you in a wilderness season? God may be shaping you in ways you can't see. The quiet years are not wasted years. Secondly, are you doing something that feels small or insignificant, like tending sheep? God uses the ordinary to train us for the extraordinary, and the lesson is to be faithful where you are. And thirdly, have you stopped listening for God's call? Don't rush through life. Slow down, look, listen. God may be calling your name in unexpected places. And so a prayer that we should pray something like this: Lord, help me not to despise the wilderness. Shape me in the quiet, humble places. Teach me to lead like a shepherd with patience, courage, and compassion. And when you call, help me to say, here I am. Prepare me for your purpose and in your time. Amen.